What happens when one of music's most legendary icons comes face to face with a talk show host who thinks he can push any boundary for a cheap laugh? You won't believe what unfolds when decades of Hollywood respect collides with late-night television's most controversial moments. Tonight, we're breaking down the explosive confrontation that left audiences stunned, social media in chaos, and one of entertainment's biggest stars walking off set in the middle of a live broadcast. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Cher made her entrance, her sequined jacket catching the studio lights as she waved to the cheering audience. At 77, the entertainment legend still commanded the room with a presence that few could match. She'd been booked on Jimmy Kimmel Live to promote her upcoming autobiography and reflect on her 6-decade career spanning music, film, and Broadway. What should have been a celebration of artistic achievement was about to become something entirely different. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with his trademark grin, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. Sources backstage later revealed he'd been particularly agitated during rehearsals, making snide comments about aging divas and their unrealistic demands. The tension was already brewing before the cameras started rolling, but no one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral out of control. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incomparable Cher," Kimmel announced, his voice carrying that familiar late-night energy. The audience erupted as Cher took her seat, adjusting her flowing black pants and offering that iconic smile that had captivated audiences for generations. But keen observers noticed something in Kimmel's eyes, a glint that suggested he had more than standard interview questions planned for the evening. The opening moments proceeded normally enough. Kimmel asked about her book, her early days with Sonny Bono, and her thoughts on today's music industry. Cher responded with her characteristic wit and candor, sharing anecdotes that had the audience laughing and applauding. She spoke about overcoming industry sexism, her struggles with dyslexia, and her journey to becoming one of the few performers to achieve EGOT status: Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony Awards. "You know, Cher, you've had such an incredible career," Kimmel said, leaning back in his chair with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "But I have to ask about something that's been bothering me." The shift in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Cher's smile flickered slightly, her performer's instincts immediately picking up on the change in energy. "What's that, Jimmy?" she asked, maintaining her composure but sitting slightly straighter in her chair. "Well, you've been pretty vocal on social media about politics lately," Kimmel continued, his grin taking on a sharper edge. "Some might say, obsessively so. Don't you think celebrities should stick to entertaining instead of lecturing the rest of us about how to vote?" The question hit the studio like a physical force. The audience's laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Cher's expression shifted from pleasant surprise to something much more guarded. She'd faced this criticism before, but rarely so directly and never in such a public forum designed to celebrate her achievements. "Excuse me?" Cher's voice carried decades of experience dealing with difficult interviewers, but there was steel beneath the velvet now. "I think I have the right to express my opinions just like any other American citizen, Jimmy. My career doesn't disqualify me from caring about this country." Kimmel chuckled, but it wasn't the warm laugh his audience was used to. "Of course you have the right. I'm just wondering if maybe your fans tune in to hear gypsies, tramps, and thieves, not your thoughts on tax policy." The audience shifted uncomfortably, in their seats, sensing that something was going very wrong very quickly. Cher's composure remained intact, but those who knew her could see the warning signs. Her hands had stopped gesturing, her posture had become more rigid, and her eyes had taken on that sharp focus that had intimidated Hollywood executives for decades. "My fans are intelligent people who can appreciate both my music and my right to speak my mind," she replied evenly. "They don't need to be protected from my opinions." Right, right. Kimmel nodded, but his tone suggested he disagreed completely. It's just that some of your tweets have been, well, let's call them passionate. Almost angry, really. Is that the image you want to project at this stage of your career? The bitter, ranting celebrity? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several audience members gasped audibly, and even Kimmel's own band seemed to shift uncomfortably behind their instruments. This wasn't playful late-night banter anymore. This was a deliberate provocation, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Cher's famous composure began to crack, not from weakness but from a righteous anger that had been building since the interview began. "Bitter?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "Jimmy, I've been fighting for what I believe in since before you were born. I've used my platform to support civil rights, LGBTQ+ equality, and basic human decency. If that makes me bitter in your eyes, then I wear that label proudly." But Kimmel wasn't finished. In fact, he seemed energized by her response, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment to push even harder. The studio lights felt hotter, the silence more oppressive, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. What started as a routine celebrity interview was rapidly transforming into something much more dangerous, and there was no going back. "Look, Cher, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Kimmel continued, his voice taking on that condescending tone that late-night hosts often use when they think they're being clever. "You're 77 years old. Don't you think it's time to maybe dial back the political activism and focus on your legacy? I mean, some of your recent statements have been, well, let's just say they haven't aged well." The audience was now completely silent, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that makes even seasoned performers squirm. But Cher wasn't squirming. If anything, she seemed to be growing more powerful with each insult, like a storm gathering strength. Her eyes never left Kimmel's face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades in an industry that had tried to silence strong women countless times before. "What statements exactly are you referring to, Jimmy?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. "Because I've been very consistent in my beliefs. I believe in equality, I believe in justice, and I believe in holding people accountable for their actions. If that bothers you, that says more about you than it does about me." Kimmel leaned forward, clearly believing he had the upper hand. "Well, there was that tweet about the Supreme Court, and that whole thing about voting rights. And don't even get me started on your comments about certain political figures. Some people might call that unhinged." The word unhinged hit the studio, like a slap. Several audience members actually gasped out loud, and Cher's expression shifted from controlled anger to something much more dangerous. She had spent her entire career fighting against men who tried to diminish her intelligence, her relevance, and her right to speak her mind. And now, on live television, in front of millions of viewers, Jimmy Kimmel had just crossed a line that should never have been crossed. "Unhinged?" Cher repeated, her voice rising for the first time since the interview began. "Jimmy, let me tell you what's unhinged. What's unhinged is using your platform to attack a guest who came here in good faith. What's unhinged is thinking that, because you have a microphone, you can disrespect someone who's been fighting for what's right longer than you've been alive." But instead of backing down, Kimmel doubled down. His producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, trying to get him to change course, but he seemed oblivious to their desperate gestures. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. "Fighting for what's right," he scoffed. "Cher, you live in a mansion in Malibu. You travel on private jets. You haven't lived in the real world for decades. What gives you the authority to lecture working class Americans about their politics?" The attack was personal now, and everyone in the studio knew it. This wasn't comedy anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was a deliberate character assassination happening in real time. Cher's hands gripped the arms of her chair, and for a moment it looked like she might actually get up and leave. But she didn't. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone. She smiled. Not the practiced celebrity smile she'd worn at the beginning of the interview, but something sharper, more predatory. "You want to talk about the real world, Jimmy?" she said, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made even the production crew stop what they were doing to listen. "Let me tell you about the real world. I grew up poor. I was a single mother. At 19, I've been discriminated against, talked down to, and dismissed by men like you my entire career. And you know what? I survived it all, and I thrived. So don't you dare lecture me about authenticity." The power dynamic in the studio had shifted completely. What had started as Kimmel's ambush was now becoming Cher's moment of reckoning. She was no longer the guest being interrogated. She was a force of nature, and everyone present could feel the energy crackling around her. But Kimmel, either too proud or too foolish to recognize what was happening, pressed on with his attack. "Survived? Thrived?" he laughed. But there was no humor in it anymore. "Cher, you've been married how many times? 2? 3? And your relationship with your own daughter has been rocky at best. Maybe instead of trying to fix the world, you should focus on fixing your own family." The studio went dead silent. This was no longer just inappropriate. It was cruel. Kimmel had just brought up some of the most painful aspects of Cher's personal life, including her complicated relationship with her transgender son, Chaz, in front of a live audience. Even his own band members were looking at him with undisguised disgust, and several audience members had started to boo. Cher stood up slowly, her full height and presence commanding the entire studio. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but everyone could hear the fury barely contained beneath the surface. "How dare you?" she said, each word precise and cutting. "How dare you bring my family into this? You invited me here to talk about my career, my book, my achievements. Instead, you've spent the entire time trying to tear me down like some playground bully." Kimmel seemed to realize he'd gone too far, but instead of apologizing, he tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on, Cher. This is television. It's supposed to be entertaining. Can't you take a joke?" "A joke?" Cher's voice was now loud enough to fill every corner of the studio without a microphone. "Jimmy, there's nothing funny about what you just did. There's nothing entertaining about attacking someone's family. You've shown your true colors tonight, and they're uglier than I ever imagined." The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Camera operators were unsure whether to keep filming. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and Kimmel's producers were making increasingly frantic gestures from the sidelines. But the damage was done, and everyone present knew that this confrontation was about to reach a point from which there would be no return. Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of his mistake, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Look, Cher, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we take a commercial break and start over?" His voice had lost its earlier bravado, replaced by something that almost sounded like desperation. But it was too little, too late. Cher looked at him with a mixture of disgust and pity that was somehow more devastating than pure anger would have been. "Start over," she said, her voice carrying across the silent studio like a judge delivering a verdict. "Jimmy, you can't unsay what you just said. You can't undo the disrespect you've shown not just to me, but to every woman who's ever been dismissed, belittled, or attacked for having the audacity to speak her mind." The audience, which had been uncomfortably silent throughout most of the confrontation, began to murmur their agreement. A few scattered voices called out, "That's right," and "You tell him, Cher." The tide was turning completely, and Kimmel seemed to sense it. His usual cocky demeanor was cracking, replaced by the look of a man who suddenly realized he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Cher, I think you're overreacting," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is just how late-night television works. We push boundaries, We ask tough questions. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal? Cher's voice rose to a level that filled every corner of the studio without any assistance from the sound system. You attacked my family, questioned my sanity, and tried to silence me for having opinions. If that's not personal, then you're even more out of touch than I thought. She turned to face the audience directly, her presence commanding their complete attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when powerful men think they can treat women like disposable entertainment. They invite us on their shows, pretend to respect us, and then try to tear us down for their own amusement. The audience erupted in applause, and several people stood up to show their support. Even some of the production crew members were nodding, in agreement, their professional neutrality abandoned in the face of what they'd just witnessed. Kimmel looked around desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone, who might come to his defense, but found only disapproving stares. "You know what, Jimmy?" Cher continued, her voice now steady and controlled, like a master performer who had found her rhythm. "I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've dealt with executives who tried to control me, critics who tried to diminish me, and countless men who thought they could define my worth. But I'm still here, and I'm still standing, because I never let anyone silence me." She began to remove her microphone, her movements deliberate and final. "I came here, tonight, to talk about my book, to share some stories, to connect with people who might find inspiration in my journey. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who clearly has his own issues with strong women." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Cher, please, don't leave. We can work this out. Maybe I was a little harsh, but—" "A little harsh?" Cher interrupted, her eyes flashing with renewed fire. "Jimmy, you just spent the last 20 minutes trying to humiliate me on national television. You questioned my intelligence, attacked my activism, and brought my family into your petty little power play. There's no working this out." She stood up fully now, her sequined jacket catching the studio lights one final time as she prepared to make her exit. The camera operators, unsure of protocol, but recognizing the historic nature of the moment, kept filming as Cher delivered what would become one of the most quoted responses in late-night television history. "Let me tell you something that might actually educate your audience," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every word. "Success isn't about tearing other people down. It's not about using your platform to attack and diminish. Real success, real power, comes from lifting others up, from using your voice to make the world a little bit better." She looked directly at Kimmel, who had shrunk back in his chair like a scolded child. "You had an opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who's lived through decades of history, who's overcome obstacles you can't even imagine, who's used her success to fight for people who don't have a voice. Instead, you chose to be small, petty, and mean-spirited." The studio was now completely under her control. Every person present was hanging on her every word, witnessing what would surely go down as one of the most powerful moments in television history. Even the production crew had stopped their frantic signaling and were simply watching in awe as a true professional showed them how it was done. "I don't need this," Cher declared, her voice ringing with finality. "I don't need your show. I don't need your approval. And I certainly don't need to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly doesn't understand the first thing about dignity or class." She began walking toward the exit, her head held high, every step radiating the confidence and grace that had made her a star for over 6 decades. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. But Cher wasn't finished. She stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time, her voice cutting through the applause like a blade. "And Jimmy, the next time you want to attack someone for speaking their truth, maybe you should take a long, hard look in the mirror first, because what I saw tonight wasn't a talk show host doing his job. What I saw was a bully who got called out and couldn't handle it." With that, she walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned silence broken only by the continued applause of an audience that had just witnessed something extraordinary. Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his usual quick wit completely abandoned. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation for posterity. As Cher disappeared through the studio doors, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. The applause wasn't just for her dramatic exit. It was for her dignity, her strength, and her refusal to be diminished by someone who had clearly underestimated who they were dealing with. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate far beyond that studio. In less than an hour, clips of the altercation would be spreading across social media, sparking conversations about respect, dignity, and the way women are treated in the entertainment industry. Cher had walked off that stage, but she had also walked away as the clear victor in a battle that never should have been fought in the first place.